my process usually starts out with these beautiful sketchbooks. I have, even though I'm a sculptor, I also enjoy drawing, and I often can't build to the accelerated pace of how I'm coming up with ideas, and so I feel like I need to get the ideas down and store them and sort of make an agreement with the ideas that when I can get the resources to do the work, then I'll do it. But as long as it's there, it's recorded, it's on the agenda, as it were. So my process usually starts out in the sketchbook. Just things that I obsess with, things that I, can't get out of my head, or things that amuse me. I love doodling, I love drawing of all sorts, so I tend to draw caricatures of people. Since 2007, this is the heart of my practice. These are all my sketchbooks, plus these here and these here, pretty much filled to the brim of drawings. So I'm kind of keeping, it's all about keeping ideas alive and keeping, a record of your own chronological process that I think is important. Not very graceful. So you can only get so far in the sketchbooks until you have to visualize something in 3 dimensions. This is just a quick cardboard study for a piece that I'm working on called Tunguska. It's the further stage of the one that I have up at BT&C now. So from the model, between the drawings in the sketchbook, the 2D format and the 3D format, it allows me to figure out spatial parameters and what I need to, bring my ideas to physical life. So from there, it would go to, if I'm still invested in the idea after the maquette, it would go into a larger size maquette, maybe a rough build, or maybe CAD drawings. I work a lot in AutoCAD. I have a background as a drafter and model builder, and so that whole arc of experience has informed the way I work. So in order to visualize things, I need to understand what the materials are, what the spatial constraints are, and what I need to do to make things fit together. Going to grad school was almost the rightest thing that could happen to me as an artist, because it allowed me to plumb the depths of my own character and justify the ideas and thoughts that I had always had. For me, I'm interested in psychology, my own psychology, and tying that to the notion of architectural space and compartments. So some of the ideas come from prior developments of pieces. So if I do something, I flesh it out, it doesn't quite work, or I want to then build on that. So sometimes the idea can come from the eureka moment after, I don't usually drink for inspiration. I drink to celebrate after the work is done. So drinking for me never usually translates in coming up with good ideas. It's usually the after product. I think sometimes it's like the ideas come just by being, just by sitting there with a cup of coffee, staring at the wall, or staring at your sketchbook, or so I don't know if that answers the question perfectly, but I think it's a combination of all those factors that come together. And so what my point was with the grad school thing is I learned to be open to all those stimuli. When I got out of undergrad, I used to get my sketchbook, I used to sit down, I'm going to think brilliant ideas, I'm going to do it, and if I didn't like what I was doing, I would beat myself up, I would rip up the page, I would put it away, I would sit and languish for months. Now I realize that, ideas, they take a lot of nurturing, they take a lot of gestating, they take a lot of development, they take a lot of being with them, or them being with you. And I think that's one of the more valuable lessons I learned, is just to just to get it down, get it out of your head and get it into some format, whether it's 2D, 3D, a model, it's going to be there, okay? So I don't have the means to build this thing right now, but the model allows me the touchstone to come back to it, to know that I need to get this done, I need to work on this, I need to keep this alive. So that's with me. I think not overt, not literally. So I tend to use political relationships, hierarchies, the individual versus the sort of institution, that kind of thing. But it's sort of a removed layer. It's not a direct, like I don't comment on Bernie Sanders, or I don't think that's my calling. I think that you have to understand where you approach your artwork from. So yes, there are underlying ideas. They affect me, they affect the work, but they're not overt ideas. Like sometimes they can come in the form of nomenclature. I had an installation that involved putting the viewer into a very awkward space to view a scale model architectural vignette of a floor collapsed in a residential home, and to me that evoked a sense of insecurity and trauma. And the first person I thought of was Tom Ridge, the director of Homeland Security during the George Bush administration, which I think the administration itself greatly impacted its mark upon my indelible consciousness. I think we lost out with the country. The 8 years that they reigned was traumatic, and but the figures that came out of that, the cabinet figures, I think were idiosyncratic enough to lend themselves maybe to metaphorical association. So I may think the viewer, in naming the piece Tom Ridge, I may think that the viewer would come to not that the piece is about him directly, because I don't really care about him directly, but about what he represented. So director of the Homeland Security is going to protect our borders, and by illustrating a vignette which showed the opposite, it's kind of, you know, playing with that notion and subverting it a bit. But I would say that, you know, I know that there's a lot of people into social practice work now, and there's a lot of people into, you know, they really feel like their artwork has to be about politics. I don't have that calling. I don't want to have that calling. I think that I'm open enough to myself that if it came through as you need to do this, I would do it. But it's just not there. And I'd rather be political in the ballot box than I would with my art. It's just the way I am. The uncanny came to me as a conceptual, I guess, touchstone in grad school. I was doing the work that I was doing, but one of my instructors, Gary Nicard, who's I guess a hero instructor of mine, well, hero is not the right word, but mentor, right? Theoretical mentor. And I think that he could tie instantly what I was doing to Freud's theories of the uncanny. And so once I finally did the research on that, once I finally investigated it, I came to the same conclusion that the work is on a path of exploration that is tangential, or shares the same trajectory as what some of the ideas that Freud was talking about. So with the uncanny comes this notion of things that were once known that were forgotten, but have then been revealed through some instance, through some circumstance. And I think that often entails a covering up or an exposure of something that is underneath, though subterranean and underneath. I am not sure. I mean, you know, these things probably go back to early childhood. I think as a child, I always used to build forts and cocoon-like structures, and I was fascinated by, I think I love that sense of security and of being surrounded by and covered over by something. And so, you know, Freud probably would read that as a longing to be back in the womb. That's probably, I think that's the read from the uncanny. But the uncanny also, one of the foundations that Freud bases his on is this, I think it's a psychologist named Jentsch, who defines the uncanny as intellectual uncertainty. And I think that also is a touchstone for me. The idea of cognitive dissonance and trying to pair two disparate realities together that can't be paired or that are incompatible in their essences, right? We often think of 9/11 as a perfect example. You know, I grew up in a weird time. I grew up in the 70s in suburban New York State. My parents were, you know, they worked. My mom and dad both worked for like GE, and I remember a lot of, like, at the time there were a lot of weird superstitious kind of things in the air that, you know, would be talked about at the dinner table at night. And, you know, I would internalize these things, you know, because you know, as a child, I think you're pretty gullible, and or you're, you know, you listen to things, and there were all these things in the air that would they would be nullified in the daylight, but when night hit and the dusk hit, all these things sort of come to bear of, like, you know, because I grew up Catholic, which is a weird kind of thing. I always call it the creative gift that keeps on giving. You know, so marrying the stuff that I was learning in, like, Catholic grammar school and high school, and the things, the superstitious stories, the topics of UFOs, Bigfoot, all kinds of weird things that were happening. You know, the Charles Manson, the Son of Sam kind of thing in the atmosphere. There's a weirdness in the atmosphere that, you know, just indelibly recorded itself in my psyche. And I think, you know, I think art, the format of being an artist allows us to articulate that which cannot be articulated in any other way but through our work. And so, in some sense, I'm sort of giving testimony to some of that high strangeness that I experienced as a child, and then, you know, incorporating other interests into it. So the question is, what would we do if we had very few constraints on us, financial or timeline constraints and the type of projects? I'm envisioning a series of, I call it a suite of installations that involve similar in scale to works that I've created, like the one up at BT&C now. It's called Tunguska Minor. So similar to that in scale, in which the show would be just installations, and it would involve bringing the viewer into, part of my practice is interested in bringing the viewer into a disoriented physical state, at the same time allowing them to view certain architectural model like vignettes or dioramas. So I would employ that tactic to multiply the amount of work. So I envision 3 or 4 pieces all relating to this notion of cognitive dissonance and this notion of physical and mental disorientation. So I have a piece where I want to bring the body from a standing to almost nearly upside down while they're viewing something. So there's that piece. There's a piece where I want to create a narrow crawl space that you have to really physically work to get into in order to see the piece. So, but I think if I had no constraints, that would be a dangerous place for me, because I think constraints are important. I think constraints force you into a scenario where you have to make things work because you have limited resources. And I think there's something significant that comes out of that. Sometimes if you look at the artists that get that limitless budget and see the things they do, you look at it like, well, you're just, I don't know, you're buying something big, you know, and maybe the idea has more impact smaller. Maybe the idea has more impact if it's rough and ready, if it's rough and not fully crafted to the nth degree. So I don't know what I would do. I think I've always envisioned limits, and I think limits give you, they allow you to envision a scope of work based on those limits. So if there were none, I would be worried that I would not complete anything. because I would just keep building and building and building, you know. Could be problematic. So I do have a ritual, a studio ritual. I often feel that I don't do a lot at home other than get ready to come to the studio, which is just, you know, feed the cat, make sure we're good there, and come to the studio. But there's a sense of relief when I walk in the door. I feel like it's my place. And, you know, I used to feel like I came from a family that didn't know about art as a way of life. And so this kind of thing would probably appear as a selfish endeavor. Oh, you know, they're not taking care of the house, they're not trying to get married and have a family and do the right things that way. But I feel, so they might think of that in another way, but I feel like a sense of relief when I come through that door. And my ritual typically is come in, turn all the lights on. I usually turn the chair light on, the drafting table light, and the overheads. And I'll put Brian Eno's Music for Airports on all the time. It's ambient music. I think it's the first ambient CD. And there's something about that just, it can be played on and on and on, on and on. I never get sick of it. It always it allows me to ramp up my energies. And then, of course, a cup of coffee if it's the morning. If it's the early morning, it's coffee. If not, midday would be just some sort of caffeine drink to keep me going. But that's normally it. And I'll look around. I love to have projects. I have a ton of things going at the same time because I often get stuck on things. And I'll work them to a certain degree, and then I can't figure out the resolution, so I put it aside. But as long as I've learned that the routine is, I used to beat myself up for that. I used to really torture myself about not having the resolution right away. But I've learned to work with that. I've learned to slow down, be patient with myself, and I've learned to start a number of projects and keep them all going. As long as I can massage the project a little bit every day, if I see some results of change. Sometimes that's difficult to see in a day because a lot of times my work is very time-consuming and meticulous. I don't say that to be arrogant or anything. It just is the way it is. I like to, if I know that I have a bunch of laser cuts that need to be glued together, that's really wonderful for me. It's busy work. And while I'm doing that work, I'm thinking of other ideas and thinking. So my ritual is, I guess, maybe not too much different from a lot of other artists, but I've learned to love it. That make me uneasy the most would be the stability of my home front at this point. Before I went to grad school, I graduated from Alfred University, went to and I moved to Buffalo for a job, and I started to do my art, but it never really took off. I got married, we bought houses, life happened, I got divorced, and then I went to grad school, and that's allowed me to learn to put things in perspective. But with that said, the trade-offs. I used to work for a corporation. I had a good job, but I was not fulfilled in my spirit, so I gave it up. I knew I wasn't doing the right thing. And so now the trade-off with being an artist is poverty. Right? When I got my MFA, I was one of the proudest days of my life, and yet I knew that I was joining the ranks of the hyper-educated poor. So eking out a living, that's the thing that gnaws at all of us, I think, at this point, is working adjunct jobs, or, you know, if you do an art handling job, how am I going to pay the next series of bills? How can I afford to make this piece, which requires, you know, smooth-on products, which are expensive to cast, that kind of thing. My car, a week before my show, a recent show, Unknown Knowns at BT&C, a week before the show, I got home from my residency, and my car, I think I blew the head gasket. And that was a point where I just, you know, said, what am I doing? I'm a grown man, I don't have a car, it doesn't work, I can't get to the location of my show to install it, but, you know, I was blessed with good friends. My friend Mark lent me his truck for 2 weeks, and, you know, somehow it resolved itself. But those are the things that really give you worries, you know, the real life concerns of how I'm going to eat, ability of my home front, and so on. Other things don't bother me as much, right? Once I get that kind of stuff met, then I can be at my peace in the studio and I can work. If I'm too nervous about that stuff, it tends to bleed in and affect how productive I can be in the work, and and how much I can pull off. For me, some of the important lessons that I learned from undergrad, from trying to make artwork post-undergrad, were the necessity of being in a community where there are similar people doing the same thing. I used to have jobs that put me in the real world. During those experiences, the real world does not have a practical application for art. And so after a while, the real world ideas start infiltrating and start making you second guess yourself, which I think is terrible. It's really a hell on earth for an artist. You need to be in a community of similar artists, of similar people in the similar sort of aspiration. So brothers and sisters in suffrage, right? It's like, if I know Mark's struggling with the same things I am, I don't doubt myself as a freak. I don't say, oh, I'm the only one experiencing this in the world. I know others are. Another serious lesson was, it's hard, but getting rejections, right? You have to keep applying for things. This year I've probably applied for over 25 or 30 things. I maybe got 2 acceptances, right? So it's developing a thick skin and really in being able to endure the buffets of the art world. It's very tough, and I think you don't go into this practice for riches or celebration or anything like that. You go into it because A, it's the only thing you can do this well, or B, you're compelled to do it from some internal reason. And I think knowing that, through my grad school experiences, through my Buffalo art community experiences, but also through my residencies, coming together with people from disparate parts of the country who share the same aspirations you do and the same struggles is super important. Knowing you're not alone and being encouraged enough to get up and do it every day.